Hello and welcome to National Park Wild. I'm Eric, and this is part 2 of the best thing to do in every national park. Make sure you check out part 1 if you haven't already, and come back to this one once you have. That one has some disclaimers, such as the fact that I've not been to American Samoa, so that park will be excluded. And for parks I've not spent a lot of time in, I will give an alternate best thing to do besides my personal favorite, so you have a good idea of one of the go-to things to do in each national park. Let's jump in. Indiana Dunes National Park is where we left off. So this one, I'm going to go with West Beach Trail as the best thing to do. I don't think Indiana Dunes is the most impressive hiking or activities, but this trail is probably the best one. You go along the dunes, and you're along the water as well. There's a bit of diversity in it, and I think it's a pretty solid trail overall. Isle Royale National Park in Michigan is another one that I think has a lot of hikes that are very unique. The thing about them is they're very backcountry oriented and many of them are in the thick trees and such. There is one exception though, and that is Stoll Trail. Stoll Trail goes to the rocky coastline of the island, and it is beautiful. I think this is one of the most stellar views in any national park or any area in the Great Lakes. I think it's just a stunning one, and definitely a top priority at the park. Joshua Tree National Park in California is next up, and this one's a bit tougher, because I have not done one trail that a lot of people talk about, and that is Ryan Mountain. I hear that's the best trail in the park, so definitely prioritize that. However, I want to shout out the underrated Barker Dam. Barker Dam has some of the best wildlife in the park. The amount of birds I saw, from woodpeckers to falcons to ducks, that was something I definitely was not expecting to see, but I heard people found pelicans on that trail once, so you never know. And the trail itself goes past some nice, unique boulders, which Joshua Tree is kind of known for, abundant yucca plants, which are the Joshua trees, of course, and you get a nice mountain backdrop, and the dam itself, when not drained, does give a very unique sort of oasis feel, because you have a large body of water, and you're kind of in the desert, so it just feels very interesting. Now let's go up north to Katmai National Park in Alaska. An impossible choice between two, Brooks Falls and Valley of 10,000 Smokes. Brook Falls is where the bears are. This is one of the best wildlife viewing areas in the world. You can see brown bears fishing for salmon. Best to see them in summer, and there's a viewing platform so you can enjoy them. You get pretty up close, and even when you're not right at the falls, the walk to and from the falls is almost guaranteed to give you more bear sightings. So that's something special. However, the Valley of 10,000 Smokes is also not to be missed. It's best to fly over it, that's pretty much how most people see it, and you'll be soaring over a massive mountain range covered in volcanic ash from one of the largest volcanic eruptions in North American history. That is something special, and it is one of the most marvelous views I've ever seen. If you're lucky, depending on weather and all, you can even go to the top of Mount Katmai and look inside the massive volcano that erupted. Now for another Alaska park, Kenai Fjords. This one, I have not done the main thing, the fjords, which is on the water, so definitely spend some time going to the coastal parts, but on the land, Exit Glacier and Harding Ice Field are a must. Exit Glacier, you can see how far it's receded in recent years, but it is still a massive one, and the sheer size of Exit Glacier is spectacular. Going into the Harding Ice Field, it just gets more and more impressive, and it's definitely one of the best things to see in all of Alaska. Now for Kings Canyon National Park, this one I can't really comment on. My personal favorite is the Grant Grove, but I have not gone into the canyon. So I'm going to recommend Zumwalt Meadow and all the other hikes that are in the canyon. That is the best thing you can do. After taking the excellent drive into the canyon, from what I understand, some of the hiking here is the best of any national park. I hear that very often. I hear the park is underrated. That said, do not miss Grant Grove as well, because Grant Grove gives you a view of the second largest tree in the world, General Grant, and because not a whole lot is surrounding that particular tree, it's a pretty otherworldly sight. Back to Alaska, Kobuk Valley National Park. This is one that doesn't have a ton of sights that you can see because it's in the Arctic Circle, so you can't really get out of your car and hike, but seeing the Great Kobuk Sand Dunes from above and on them is probably the best sight here. seeing sand dunes in Alaska is fascinating. And there's not a whole lot else to say, because at that point you just go wherever you want. You can walk through the sand dunes, go along the water, go toward the mountains. There's quite a bit to see. If you enjoy being out in the wilderness on your own, it's hard to beat this. Staying in Alaska, Lake Clark National Park is one of the most beautiful of any. And there is one major attraction here you can do that'll take you right back to something like Glacier National Park, and that is Tenalian Mountain. Tenalian Mountain is a somewhat strenuous hike, because getting to the top of the ridge of the main mountain, it's very steep and also very narrow, and it's unmaintained, so there's a lot of loose rock. I was quite frightened by the trail, but the view at the top was worth it. Towering over Lake Clark and mountains of all different colors, getting the true 360-degree view. Like, when I say panoramic views, there is none more panoramic than this. I think it is phenomenal, and definitely one of my favorite national park hikes, period. And absolutely the best thing to do in Lake Clark National Park, even when there's other great things to do. Back to California, Lassen Volcanic National Park is one that has some pretty underrated hikes, but the most underrated is Lassen Peak. Lassen Peak is kind of like an easier version of Tenalian Mountain. The best things about it are, of course, the view from the top, because you can see nearby recreation areas, look to some of the other sites of Lassen Volcanic National Park, such as the Cinder Cones and the Geyser Basin, and you can look all the way to Mount Shasta on a clear day. Because Lassen Volcanic is kind of at the south end of the Cascade Range, you can see one of the other great peaks of this range. I think the hike also gives you nice views of wildlife, as we saw a falcon, pikas, and it's a very nice little one. It's not the hardest mountain hike, so it's fairly accessible for many, and it's also just a beautiful one. Definitely, probably still one of my top 10 national park hikes ever, out of well over 150. Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky is one that's hard to pinpoint a single good thing to do, as there are several cave tours that give you different parts of the cave and very unique perspectives. No cave tour is the same, but I personally think if you're not up for the wild cave tour, Violet City Lantern is probably the best way to go. Any trail that gives you a view of frozen Niagara, though, in terms of the cave tours, is probably the best one, though. There's a lot of cave tours, I've not done all of them, but I do know that frozen Niagara is one of the most impressive and just quirky cave formations in the park. It's a bunch of stalactites kind of grouped together in a way that does resemble a waterfall, hence the name Frozen Niagara. So I definitely think Mammoth Cave, while it has some nice stuff above the ground, such as the Green River Ferry and a few hikes, doing a cave tour is a necessity. Just make sure you book ahead if necessary. Mesa Verde National Park in Colorado is another one where tours can be the best thing to do. Touring the cliff dwellings is a wonderful experience because you get to see ancient cliff dwellings that were made by Native Americans thousands of years ago. And the fact that they're well preserved today, and they're still along caves and cliffs and canyons and all that. Cliff Palace is probably the best one of them all. It is expansive, and getting up close to all the different buildings that were made is just a sight that you cannot replicate in any other national park. There are a few other sites that give you views of cliff dwellings, but I think it's hard to beat Mesa Verde. So the Cliff Palace tour, make sure you book ahead, just like with Mammoth Cave, is one that's pretty great. Mount Rainier National Park in Washington, I have not done the personal best thing. See, I did Grove of the Patriarchs. It's a simple forest hike over a crystal clear river. That said, many would say the best trails are Wonderland Trail and Skyline Loop. Skyline Loop gives you great views of the mountain, and Wonderland Trail does as well. They go around it, give you different angles and perspectives of the massive peak, and while I enjoy Grove of the Patriarchs, the two aforementioned trails are definitely the main ones I prioritize. New River Gorge National Park in West Virginia is definitely a great park to add. It was the newest national park as of this video being recorded, and while there are a lot of great trails, my favorite by far is Long Point. Long Point takes you into the gorge. And when I say into the gorge, I don't mean in terms of elevation level. I mean, once you get to the viewpoint of the trail, you are in the middle of the gorge, at a similar elevation of the bridge and the two sides, but you are between the two main canyon walls, if you will, of the gorge. You look down to see the river, you're looking straight ahead at the very iconic bridge, and it is a view that beats everything else in the park for me. I love Sandstone Falls and Endless Wall, but it is very hard to beat Long Point Trail. North Cascades National Park is one I must admit I have to get back to. The best I've seen is Diablo Lake, due to the fact that I've only gone when the weather was not good enough to get any further, but there are two great trails in Sourdough Pass and Sahel Arm Pass. I believe both are really strong day hikes and can be turned into backpacking trips if necessary. But they have views very similar to the Swiss Alps from what I've heard, and who does not like the Alps? So definitely try to do some of the longer and more strenuous, but much more rewarding hikes when you go to North Cascades. Staying in Washington, Olympic National Park has three distinct areas. You have the beaches, the rainforest, and the mountain. My personal favorite is the mountains. That is definitely a personal thing though. I highly recommend spending time in all of the areas. Hurricane Bridge, for me, is the one thing to prioritize. Abundant wildlife and great views of mountains. But there is also Ruby Beach and Claylock and all the other coastal regions that have large rocks, expansive sandy beaches, tide pools, and much more. Solduck Falls in the rainforest area is a nice waterfall, and the Hoh Rainforest is one that is so vibrant and has banana slugs, which is always a fun little wildlife sighting, that I think it is also one not to be missed. All of these areas are very unique and make Olympic what it is, so try to spend some time in all of them. Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona is one that has some surprisingly great sights. The rock formations are unique, but none more unique than Blue Mesa. The blues and purples that can be found in this one, and the fact that you walk on top of and within them on the main trail, makes it one of the most odd, but also very pleasant national park sites. There's a lot of different photo opportunities, and I think it's one of the best trails in Arizona. Pinnacles National Park in California is one very few talk about and very few like, but I think it's a pretty underrated one. My favorite hiking experience is the Bear Gulch Cave. Pinnacles has unique caves known as talus caves because they are above ground and were formed by rocks falling. So you walk through these unique tunnels of rock, and it can be very difficult, but it's very fun to come out with a sort of waterfall next to you and you're at the Bear Gulch Reservoir. A very nice view on a clear day, and it's just very fun to walk through caves unguided on your own. It's a very adventurous hike, and one I think most adventurous hikers will definitely enjoy. Staying in California once again, Redwood National Park has a very vast array of things to see. From the towering trees to the calm, rugged beaches, there's a lot, but I personally think Fern Canyon is the most unique and most stunning sight. I think it's an absolutely gorgeous one because you have a huge wall of ferns on either side of you, meaning you have a bright green canyon essentially, and you walk in the bottom of it. There's a crystal clear sort of stream going through with tons of rocks, and I think there's nothing else like it anywhere else I've been, and I love that. Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado is one that has abundant hiking trails. Trailbridge Road is a great drive, so I do recommend that as well, but my personal favorite hike is Emerald Lake. If you want to go for something really tough, do Long's Peak, but Emerald Lake is a nice one that's not as difficult. It's in the Bear Lake area, and you go past 3 different lakes, some with mountain backdrops behind them, making for picturesque areas. And I think it's one of the best hikes in Colorado for sure. Saguaro National Park in Arizona is one that doesn't have the best hikes by any means, but for me, the most stellar view in the park is a sunset at Gates Pass. This is kinda not in the national park, but it's very close, and the kind of views you can get here are hard to beat. A sunset in Saguaro is one of the best. The main thing that stands out is the reds and yellows and oranges of the sky, of course, but the fact that you have cacti in front of them, and the cacti kind of become shadows at a certain point, means you get a somewhat eerie, but also excellent view contrasting the dark and light colors. I think few sunsets are quite as good as the ones in this national park, and it's absolutely important to stay for one, so try to do more than just a day trip if you go to Saguaro. Sequoia National Park is another one similar to Rocky Mountain, with great hikes. This California park has things ranging from Morro Rock to Tokapa Falls, and Tokapa Falls is my personal favorite. I recommend seeing some of the tree areas as well, such as Congress Trail and big trees, but Tokapa Falls is one that you are surrounded by mountains. The final waterfall is very large, and no matter what time of year, because even in winter to an extent this trail is open. That said, you will be walking on like 6 feet of snow, so keep that in mind if you do it at this time of year. I think it's a very rewarding hike, one that doesn't have a ton of elevation gain per se, but still one I very much enjoy, and absolutely one of my favorite hikes I've done. Shenandoah National Park in Virginia has 2 solid mountain hikes, one I've done, one I have not. The one I've done is Bear Fence Mountain. Gives very nice views similar to the Great Smoky Mountains, and then Old Rag is one that starts at the outskirts of the park, is much more strenuous, but I've heard is even more rewarding. So it's absolutely a spectacular hike to do, and probably the best out-of-car activity you can do in Shenandoah National Park. Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota is, in my opinion, one of the most underrated. And there is one thing here that I think is absolutely important for everyone to do. It's not a hike, but a sleeping arrangement. You should stay a night in Cottonwood Campground. In my opinion, the best campground in the nation. The stargazing is great because you're not really near any civilization. You're right along the Little Missouri River, with some massive towering Badlands formations behind it, and you're likely to see wildlife. It's one of the most quote-unquote wild campgrounds I've seen, as you feel out in the wilderness more than pretty much any other. There's nothing quite like it, and I can't fully describe the feeling of staying in this campground, but I do think it was my favorite part of Theodore Roosevelt, and that is against some pretty stiff competition. Virgin Islands National Park in, unsurprisingly, the Virgin Islands, has 2 great things to do. One in water, and one on land. On land, the Ram Head Trail, kind of at the south part of the island, is similar to Stoll Trail. Has a lot of unique plant life, and once you get to the very top of the rocky cliffs, you can look all the way back to the start of St. John, where you probably took a boat from to get to the island. I think it's a very nice hike for sure, and definitely one that's worth doing, but I even more recommend Francis Bay for water activities. A very quiet and kind of unknown site to compare to like Trunk Bay and Cinnamon Bay, but still very much worth staying in for a few hours. You'll see abundant turtles, maybe even some sharks. It is a calm and tranquil place to snorkel, and it's a nice place to have a picnic if you want. It's one of my favorite beaches I think I've ever seen. Voyagers National Park in Minnesota, honestly, there's just one activity you have to do here, and you can go pretty much anywhere. That's boating. You can canoe, you can houseboat, do anything. Being on the water is definitely the best part of Voyagers. Seeing bald eagles, going to unique rocky shorelines, fishing, there's a lot to enjoy, and honestly, just being on the water is the best part of Voyagers. White Sands National Park, I've spent very, very little time in, but the Alkali Flat Trail is probably the best one here. From what I've heard, the smooth, untouched dunes, beautiful white color, pristine for sure, definitely one of the best things. Wind Cave National Park in South Dakota, this is one that I think is quite interesting because the cave tours all vary. But unlike Mammoth Cave, I think you can do pretty much any cave tour and still get a good feel for the park. So the main priority here is just doing a cave tour. First come, first serve at the visitor center, that's all I have to say. Going back to Alaska, Wrangell St. Elias is one in Alaska that I think is almost impossible to beat in terms of scale. And Root Glacier is the main reason for that. Walking on a glacier even larger than Exit, looking back to an old mining town, and looking forward to more mountains. I think it's one of the best hikes in any national park. Now for my personal favorite national park, Yellowstone in Wyoming. There is so much to see here. I highly recommend seeing Old Faithful, Grand Prismatic Spring, and Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. However, my favorite place is Lamar Valley. The abundant wildlife from bison to coyotes to even wolves, and the mountains and glaciers towering behind you, along with some waterfalls even, viewing the wildlife along the river, and being in a less popular area of the park. It's still popular, but not as crowded as others. I think that's special, and it's one of the most magical experiences I've had in a national park, period. Yosemite National Park in California also has legendary hiking. My personal favorite is Mist Trail, seeing Vernal and Nevada Falls, going above and below them, unique perspectives, seeing some wildlife along the way, looking back toward Half Dome, being in these sheer, massive granite cliffs. There's nothing else like it. That said, if you're an adventurous hiker, go all the way to Half Dome. It's very tough, but Half Dome is one of the greatest hikes in any place, period, from what I understand. You are incredibly high up, overlooking Yosemite Valley, and that is a national park experience. Zion National Park in Utah is another one with legendary hiking, and my favorite is Angel's Landing. I also recommend the Narrows and Observation Point, but Angel's Landing, this one is special. The chain section is scary, but once you get up that, it is one of the most rewarding views ever. It's like Long Point at New River Gorge, but desert and massive canyons, and it goes on forever. And there is nothing that beats that for me, and it's one of the absolute best experiences I've had in any national park. Thank you for watching part 2 of this video. Make sure you watch part 1 if you haven't already, and subscribe for more national park content. This video took a lot to make, so I really hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you next time.